Journalist!
I'm hit, but escape the car, and with producer Dominic Van Heerden, we make our way down the embankment.
Where are...
Camera operator Richie Mockler has taken 2 rounds to his body armour, but is still stuck in the car. He runs for it in a hail of bullets.
The shocking video that you just witnessed was a clip from Sky News, featuring Sky News journalists reporting from the ground in Ukraine under heavy gunfire from what was believed to be Russian reconnaissance squads ambushing civilians. Shattered glass, a hail of bullets, a mad dash for safety amid life or death conditions. This is the reality for journalists around the world who serve on the front lines of crisis and conflict. My name is Adrienne Arsht, and I'm the Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council and founder of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center and the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center here at the Atlantic Council. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the Atlantic Council for today's events. Reporters at Risk, in honor of Evan Gershkovich. A discussion of the risks facing journalists, the resilience of foreign correspondents, and global press freedom in an increasingly fraught reporting landscape. Around the world, journalists take significant risks to deliver the news and report the truth. Foreign and investigative reporters in particular experience a range of physical, psychological, and political threats across assignments, including violence, harassment, imprisonment, and death. Yet despite these obstacles, they persist in their work. Why do they continue? What makes reporting worth the risks? How do correspondents maintain courage in adversity? And how can we instill resilience in ourselves and others? As many of you know, I have long been interested in these questions of human resilience and the resilience of civilizations. What resilience looks like, how people and societies can become more resilient, and what we can learn from those who demonstrate resilience in extraordinary ways. To discuss these topics, we welcome a truly remarkable group of journalists and press advocates for 2 panel discussions. The first, a conversation with leading war correspondents about risk and resilience in war reporting, which will be moderated by Jennifer Griffin, Chief National Security Correspondent for Fox News. The second, a conversation about reporters who have endured captivity and what they risk for media freedom. It will be moderated by Andrea Mitchell, Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent at NBC News. We want to raise awareness of the plight of journalists in danger around the world, in particular, Wall Street Journal correspondent Evan Gershkovich, who remains detained in a Russian prison since his arrest on false charges of espionage earlier this year. Once again, thank you all for joining us in person and virtually for this important and timely event. Thank you to the Atlantic Council and Fred Kemp for partnering with me to host today's program. We will continue these presentations until Evan returns. And now to discuss Evan's case and more, I turn it over to Almar Latour, CEO of Dow Jones and publisher of the Wall Street Journal.
Thank you, Adrienne, and thank you for everything that you're doing for press freedom and your commitment to resilience in the face of risk. And thank you also to the Atlantic Council and to Fred and the entire team for putting a spotlight on this important topic again and again. As Adrienne just indicated, It's really hard to believe that our colleague, Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, has now been wrongfully detained for more than 6 months. And that is simply, we must remind ourselves, for doing his job. It remains an outrageous situation, an appalling situation. And that is certainly true for Evan himself, as resilient as he is, according to Russian lawyers, but also correspondents. It also is outrageous for his family, his many, many friends, and all of his colleagues at the Wall Street Journal. But it's also an alarming attack on press freedom, the free press, journalism writ large. As we all know in this room, and hopefully beyond, that without free press, there is no free society. So those are the stakes, not just Evan's, but for all of us. What's more is that Evan's incarceration is the latest in a disturbing trend, as reporters increasingly are targeted for just reporting the news. You'll hear much more about that later today. From Russia to Myanmar to Turkey, autocrats around the world are increasingly cracking down on journalists like Evan, all in an effort to stamp out independent reporting, really by any means necessary. And that's the kind of reporting that unearths facts, shapes outcomes around the world, the kind of reporting that underpins democracy, the kind of reporting that Evan himself was doing in Russia, telling stories about the Russian people, about Russian culture, indeed about the country's promise, and yes, of course, its challenges. In 2023, journalism is under attack. Make no mistake about it. Coincidentally, we are also living in an era where high-quality reporting is more important than ever before. So if I may, I would like to ask all of us in this room to keep fighting for freedom of the press. Keep fighting for the protection of journalists, especially those in combat zones and other dangerous places around the world. And keep fighting for Evan. Every day he remains in prison is too long. Let's take a look at a video here.
American journalist Evan Gershkovich is right now in Russian custody.
The U.S. State Department formally declared Evan Gershkovich, quote, wrongfully detained.
Americans should be deeply concerned about what's happening.
100 days in Russian captivity.
This was the cover of the Wall Street Journal today.
His family is asking for a global effort to get him home.
There's no evidence for the charges.
His colleagues at the Journal are promoting the hashtag #IStandWithEvan across social media.
Nothing that might even be taken as a sign of dissent is allowed in Russia right now.
Well, it was obviously very disturbing to see Evan in a glass cage just for doing his job, just for reporting.
Evan is an all-American boy.
Happy birthday to you.
Very, very curious from early age.
He always had questions about everything.
He was kind of born to be a reporter.
I know that he felt like it was his duty to report.
We condemn the detention of Mr. Gershkovich in the strongest terms.
Evan went to report in Russia to shed light on the darkness.
Evan's incarceration is an assault on free press.
Evan was doing what reporters do.
We have missed his reporting and authoritative insights into Russia at such a crucial time.
Evan is innocent.
If this can happen to my brother, it can happen to any journalist.
Our message to Evan is this: keep the faith. We won't stop until you are home.
I rely on President Biden's promise to do whatever it takes
to bring Evan back?
That video speaks for itself. So with that, I want to turn it over to Jennifer Griffin, Chief National Security Correspondent at Fox News, who will lead a conversation about the resilience of foreign correspondents. Jennifer. Thanks.
I think I'll have my panel join. Well, it's an honor to be here. Thank you, Adrian. When Adrian called me and asked me to participate, there's nothing nearer and dearer to my heart than the protection of journalists who go to the front lines. And to honor Evan in the process is just what we should be doing every day. I know all of my colleagues here, excuse me, agree with me on that. So our panel is about risk and resilience. And before we get started, I just want to remind people there are two panels, and you can submit your questions through an app. If you go to askac.org on your personal devices, you can submit for either of the panels. It's best to do so in the first half of today's programming. We'll take Q&A at the end. Is that better? Okay. If you can hear me now. So I want to thank this incredible group of friends and panelists. First, I have John Moore, who's sitting next to me. He's the senior staff photographer and special correspondent with Getty Images. John and I have known each other since we were in our early 20s, and we were based out in Islamabad and went into Afghanistan in the early 90s. And he's been taking incredible photographs ever since. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer for his work in Iraq and the Arab Spring. He also has won numerous World Press Photo and Overseas Press Club awards for his work in Pakistan and on immigration. Elizabeth Becker, this is the first time she and I have met, but her career, excuse me, my voice. Her career spans 4 decades, and she is a real hero of mine because she was one of the first women into Vietnam and Cambodia, and she interviewed Pol Pot while he was still in power, which is a story I'd like to hear more about. She reported for the Washington Post, New York Times, NPR. She won a Pulitzer for her 9/11 coverage, covered the Rwanda genocide. She was also a former Pentagon correspondent, where I am today. And she's author of an amazing book called You Don't Belong Here: How 3 Women Rewrote the Story of War. Nick Schifrin, Foreign Affairs and Defense Correspondent with PBS NewsHour. Nick has recently returned from Ukraine. He has won a Peabody Award for his series on Inside Putin's Russia. He spent years covering Gaza in 2014, received Overseas Press Club awards for that, Afghanistan, Ukraine, you name it. He was the first journalist into the Abbottabad compound after the bin Laden raid, and his video from that we all now know, but he was very quick there, and that's what these journalists do. Tom Shanker, another great colleague from the Pentagon Beat. He's now the director for the Project for Media and National Security at George Washington University. He took dozens of trips into Iraq and Afghanistan, but he started his career when the Soviet Union was falling apart, and one of his first reports from the Balkans was to report on Serb rapes of Muslim women, and that's how we learned about that atrocity. So thank you, panel, for being here. I'd like to start, John, with you and go down the line and just talk a little bit about how you got into this business and maybe one of the more harrowing moments that you have covered in your career.
Well, I started back in the early 90s. I graduated from the University of Texas, and the AP hired me to work in Latin America. So I was sent to Nicaragua with embarrassingly quite a little bit of Spanish at the time, but I learned very quickly, and learned the reasons why so many people were leaving that region then and continue to today. Back then, in the 90s, it was just after the major wars in Central America. The U.S. was still supporting, through the 80s, these right-wing dictatorships all throughout Latin America, which led to a lot of immigration and wars throughout the region. Now, as we see now, the drug cartels are in control of many areas of Central America and certainly Mexico on the street level. These pictures here from Acapulco, you can see the violence on the streets there of that city, which is currently devastated because of a recent hurricane as well. Funerals for children who were abducted where the parents couldn't pay the ransom, and you have people making this arduous trip in record numbers this year because of things that started decades ago. Many of you have perhaps seen this picture in the last couple years. It was a little girl, Yanela, who was with her mother on the border during Trump's zero tolerance policy, and that picture came to represent in some ways that whole issue just a few years ago. But as we see, people keep coming up. And I'm going to turn to one other story here and giving you an example of a close call. Back when I started out, I was actually sent from Central America to Somalia to cover the famine there in 2000, excuse me, wrong century.
That's how old we are, John.
That's right, 1992. And while there, I was actually the only wire service photographer there when George H. Bush announced troops for that country. And so I was there covering the famine. I had a security contingent of about half a dozen guys that looked sort of like this, gunmen who were in the back of a Hilux pickup truck that were driving behind me everywhere I went. It was a very strange way to work. I managed to be there when a UN convoy came for the first delivery of aid to a different part of the capital, Mogadishu, and was actually caught there by gunmen because I could no longer have my protection, because the U.S. military did not see the difference between my security guards and the enemy. And so I was actually robbed at gunpoint of all my equipment and managed to walk away unscathed, but learned very early on that some risks are not worth taking. And hopefully some of those lessons early on have served me throughout my career.
Incredible. And my husband and I preceded you in Somalia. I was also a new journalist, and he was with the AP. And it was those reports on the famine that probably led to George H.W. Bush sending the troops. Elizabeth, how did you get into this crazy business?
Early 70s, 1970s, I was in graduate school, and dispute with my major professor who thought I should go to bed with him. Classic. And in those 1972, women were not news reporters per se. And I was in Asian studies. I happened to have a friend who had gone and become a freelancer in Vietnam and then eventually Cambodia. And she said, she'd been trying to get me out there, and she said, come out. And zero experience, no job, no editor, no health insurance, and I was like all the other women. This was normal for women, and needless to say, we had to be quick learners. The risks that I would like to talk about sort of encapsulates the physical risk and the intellectual risk. When 1974, during the dry season offensive, the southern town of Kampot was surrounded by the Khmer Rouge, and the government was having trouble. So I hitched a ride on a government helicopter. This is Cambodian government. The Americans had already been stopped from their saturation bombing of the year before. Got there. It was very much under siege. I was just walking the perimeter, and the soldier up ahead of me was shot, and the guy right behind me was shot. Went back to the headquarters, happy to be alive. And lo and behold, there was an American major, Lawrence Ondecker, and he was organizing and a counteroffensive that worked and literally saved my life and all of our lives. So I got the next helicopter back the next morning and went to put on pen, and I wrote the story because that was completely illegal. And on the flight back, I had to come to terms with what it means to be a journalist. This man just saved my life. And I got him thrown out of the country, and it was a big investigation. And that was like a baptism by fire in both senses.
Nick.
I just want to say I'm just humbled to be on stage with decades of experience. And I will date myself in a second. I'll date myself in a second. In high school, I helped edit what was our high school newspaper, which only could be described as a literary rant. And so I got to college. I went to college in New York, and I looked around and wondered what I wanted to do. And I figured, well, my friends on the high school paper were more interesting, cracked better jokes, and drank more than anyone else, so I'll just do that. And so I joined the daily newspaper, not knowing what that would entail. And within a few months, I was actually hooked on the ideas of being able to ask anyone, in this case in university academics, which is what I covered, ask anyone in university academics any question, and that being my job. And it was their responsibility to talk to me, and that kind of opportunity is really what I fell in love with. And then eventually I fell in love with telling stories. And I graduated and became a professional journalist, and then shortly thereafter, almost simultaneously, was 9/11. And so my desire to ask anyone anything became a desire to go places I'd never otherwise go and meet people I'd never otherwise meet in order to ask questions I'd never otherwise be able to ask. And eventually, about 5 years later, that took me to India and then Pakistan and then London and Jerusalem. And so I feel very privileged that that's how it went down for me. In terms of close calls, you know, we all can close our eyes and hear or feel, I think, the sound of an incoming bullet or the proximity of a bomb. But for me, actually, I think what I am still bothered by, and I'll tell one of these stories later in Ukraine, but is the aftermath of attacks. I actually think that that is almost more searing than any personal threat to my body. And the one that I still dream about is the Marriott bombing attack in Islamabad, which was 2008. I'm looking at John here. We were both 2007.
That's right, just after I left.
Yeah, 2007, 2008. And I can still hear the alarm in the lobby of that hotel. I can still see the fish flapping on the ground from the giant aquarium. I can still smell the bodies that were blown apart by about 2,000 pounds of military-grade explosives that exploded right at the entrance to the hotel during Ramadan, one of the worst kind of points in Pakistani history. So to me, there have been close calls, but it is the aftermath, and you know, suicide attacks in Baghdad are the same thing. It is extraordinarily visceral to be surrounded by the five senses of death, if you will, and it's things that a lot of us will never forget.
And it's usually the smell that sticks with you.
It is very much the smell. Yeah.
Tom, take us back to the Balkans. You had an incredible story there.
Sure, but just first how I got here. I was a national security wonk in the early 80s, studied nuclear weapons policy in grad school, which went out of style, is back in style now, obviously. I was Chicago City Hall bureau chief for the Tribune. My editors felt if I could cover the Cook County Democratic machine, then the Communist Party of the Soviet Union would be a piece of cake. Went to Moscow for 5 years, a time my wife recalls as 5 winters. So I had already covered one superpower failure in Afghanistan, covered the collapse of the Gorbachev reforms, the death of the Soviet Union, and my reward was going to a place that was really the picture of the collapse of order in Europe, which was the former Yugoslavia. Which was driven apart by vile ethnic warfare. I mean, it was medieval. It was siege and burning villages and rounding up men and raping women, but all fought with 20th century weapons, and the world did nothing. And that small band in Bosnia really felt like we were putting justice back in the world by just telling those stories. And my scoops about the Serbian systematic campaign of mass rape against Muslim women actually were used at the tribunal at The Hague. So you talk about resilience, that's what gives you meaning, that's what moves you on. Journalism was collapsing. I left the Tribune, it was saved by the New York Times. 2001, Pentagon beat was open. It was a sleepy backwater beat. The secretary was this grumpy old man named Don Rumsfeld. Nobody wanted to cover him. And then 9/11 and the next 13 years were in Afghanistan and Iraq,
John, Robert Capa is looked up to by every war photographer that I've ever met. When he was 25, he took the famous photo, Death of a Loyalist Soldier, at the start of the Spanish Civil War in 1936. He was just 25 years old at the time when he took that. And it shows the exact moment that the bullet hit the soldier. And war photographers love to quote his famous quote, "If your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough." Walk us through some of your favorite photos and what you were thinking when you took them.
Well, I'll first show this story, several pictures from the Israel-Hezbollah war of 2006. I thought it would be appropriate now that we have a war in the same area. I was, in this case, photographing on the Israeli side. I've worked in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon previously to this, also covering the Second Intifada, and was there in northern Israel covering Israeli troops, covering the civilian population that was under missile attack, and seeing some of the trauma that you can see on this soldier's face as they were fighting there on the front line. One day, I blew past a Israeli checkpoint and went up towards the top of a mountain where there was an observation post. It was unmanned, and from that place, I could see these Israeli rockets and artillery flying into this Lebanese village. And I thought, wow, this is what a view. How is it that I'm possibly here? And about 15 minutes later, a reservist with the Israeli military drove up with trailing another journalist, and came up screaming at us. And just at that moment, he was in his civilian black Hummer. It exploded. And we all raced down the hill. As it turned out, no one was hurt. They blew up the vehicle, but none of us. And after that, I could only just imagine what was going through these Hezbollah militants' minds as they watched me fully exposed, photographing for 10 or 15 minutes there at that observation post, and why they didn't fire on me. And mistakes like that you can make even well into your career. And I still do sometimes. I think I learned from
They probably thought you were crazier than they were, and they were in shock seeing you.
Possibly. I'll show a few pictures from Iraq. I have so many thousands of photographs from there because I worked there for many years. But here's this one of a U.S. soldier who had been medevaced to a combat hospital, and he didn't make it. This nurse, who was, I believe, a lieutenant colonel, was on him administering CPR. This soldier didn't make it. But oftentimes the pictures are not really on the front lines. A lot of the best pictures, the most meaningful pictures, and the ones that have the most emotional result for people to see them are pictures sometimes back home. This is in the Arlington National Cemetery on Memorial Day weekend. And this woman here, Mary McHugh, she had lost her fiance months before, and this was the first time she was back there. And you know, people ask me a lot, were you invading someone's space? How does that work? And as it turned out in this picture, I had spoken with her a little bit before and chatted with her. We had exchanged email addresses just in case I had more questions. And part of what I do to mitigate any sort of issues later in guilt, if you will, is that I truly try to talk to people either before or after I make the picture. And having that sort of communication lets them know that I'm trying to tell their story, and it gives them an opportunity to decline if they so want. And so that's part of my process. Here in Ukraine, I've been this year and last year. This is on a frontline position. This is a Russian soldier there on the front line. They collected his body the next day. Civilians, of course, Nick would probably say the same thing. In Ukraine, civilians are so open to us coming into their homes. They're so grateful, in fact, that we're there covering their story. The resilience that I see in people that I photograph actually fortifies me and makes me stronger. Whether it's there or here in Libya, I lost a colleague. In fact, several photographers were killed there in Libya. As you can see in these pictures, the front line was along a highway in eastern Libya, and there was just nowhere to take cover. And so many of us who were there had been photographing the Arab Spring already in Egypt. And in Egypt, they don't allow you in with body armor. So most of us arrived to the region without our body armor with us. And when I went to Bahrain and then Libya after Egypt, myself and others were these photographers for the New York Times, from Time Magazine. We were all quite exposed. Chris Hondros, who was my colleague with Getty, who was killed a month or so after I was there. And you know, we've all known people we've lost in this profession, and it's tough, even tougher when it's someone you're very close to.
Elizabeth, what was it like being a woman in the front lines in Cambodia? And tell me about the 3 women you focused on in your book, You Don't Belong Here, Catherine Leroy, and Frances Fitzgerald, and Kate Webb.
It was, there were very few of us. And when I lived in Cambodia and covered the war, there was only one other woman who lived there full time with me, Françoise Desmaudet, who went on to win the great gold, one of the great world press photos, the first woman. And we kept a low profile. It's the opposite of now, where you're supposed to exert yourself. Very low profile. Before us, it was against the rules for women to cover the battlefield. So our heroines like Martha Gellhorn, they were stuck back with the nurses during World War II. And it was a fluke of political accident. President Johnson refused to declare war in Vietnam, and so he interpreted that, meaning he could not apply rules governing press. So it was probably the first and only war Americans fought where there was free access. One reporter compared it to having a Metro card all through Europe. So the vast majority, of course, are men. Well, really, women did not know the opportunity we found. And you could go to the battlefield, and you didn't know that you were breaking precedent. I can't tell you how dumb we were. And so when, my favorite story out of my book, when General Westmoreland went to see a Hawaiian brigade, he ran across a young woman who he knew, Denby Fawcett. Her mother played tennis with his wife back in Honolulu. And Denby was a freelancer for a Hawaii newspaper. And General Westmoreland said, "What are you doing here, Denby?" She says, "I'm covering the war." "And how long have you been here?" "Oh, 3 or 4 nights." He said, good to see you. He went back to Saigon. He said, "What's going on? Women are not allowed to be on the battlefield." So the civilian side of the Pentagon calmed him down. He said, "Listen, if you start applying all these rules, you're going to have to apply it all over, and it's a different war." So the women had to go in, and Catherine Leroy was one of the signatories. There were only about 8 who actually lived there at the time. And this is a press corps of over 1,000 people. They had to go in and sign a letter that they would not ask for any special treatment. They hadn't anyhow, but they did. And they kept this story secret, didn't tell it for 30 years. Because if people back in Washington knew, then they'd come on top of them and they'd lose their privileges. However, bylines started showing up. And this is where I go into my book. Kate Webb from Australia, Catherine Leroy from France, and Frances Fitzgerald from the United States all came, no jobs, nothing. And they had to answer they had to go through obstacles you can't imagine. The meanest one was Catherine Leroy, who turned out to be an incredible photographer, 0 training. She did so well at the beginning. She had the mentorship of Horst Voss, who said, when he became bureau chief of the photos in Saigon for AP, he said, "I'll take any good photo and print it." And he thought he was talking about helping locals. And Catherine shows up and he said, "Maybe some society pictures around Saigon?" And she said no. And so she was in the battlefield all the time. And before you knew it, she was hot. Her photos were everywhere. And behind her back, the head of Agence France Presse, a couple of other reporters, most of whom remained anonymous, pleaded with with Saigon, with the military, to revoke her privileges and throw her out. They went behind her back and they created what's called a black file that I got out through our favorite friend, Freedom of Information Act. And they accused her of swearing, being ambitious, smelling when she came off of two weeks in the battlefield, and the last one, unladylike. And on that basis, they pulled her things, and she almost was thrown out, but Horst Voss came to her rescue. And she went on to become the first woman to win the George Polk Award in photography and the first to win the Robert Capa Gold Medal.
Wow. Amazing, amazing women. Nick, what do you think has changed in terms of the dangers of covering war? What's changed from Ukraine back to the Middle East, Gaza 2014, Gaza now? The thing that struck me is that this may be the first war where there are no Western journalists on the Gaza side of the front lines, which is really stunning for all of us who covered the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for so long. It's really the first time that there aren't Western journalists there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the first thing we should say is the reason that we're here, right? The main thing that's changed is nation states' willingness to take journalists hostage and use that as a means of political goals, especially when it comes to its relationship with the United States. So that's, I think, the first thing, and we should mark Evan's detention as such. In terms of Gaza and in terms of Ukraine, you're right. It is incredibly difficult for many reasons to watch the scenes out of Gaza, but for those of us who spent a lot of time in Gaza, especially in 2014, the last time Israel invaded, even the Russian military cannot match the intensity of bombing that Israel brings into Gaza simply for the number of strikes and the amount of space that Gaza takes up. I was there for 6 weeks, and the number of close calls in terms of bombs that everybody had there, the number of families that you watch rushing into Shifa Hospital, the number of children who are killed is singular in war, and you know, there's a whole political conversation here, so I should add lots of context to that, but bottom line, that is the experience that you have in Gaza, and it is strange not to have the Western journalists in Gaza today, but I should say, PBS NewsHour, every other network has employees or freelancers or people they've worked with over the years who are filing extraordinary footage. And you know, when we say right now there's no journalists in Gaza, that is not true. Almost 40 have died covering this war so far inside Gaza. And the reason we have so many images from Gaza is so many Gazan journalists are doing this, and we should mark that as well. The other difference, of course, is the technology, and that's what we see in Ukraine. The strange confluence of World War I tactics and drones. And it is drones that really changed, I think, the threat level. And John's got his own stories for sure about this in Ukraine. But essentially what happens is when you are on the front line with Ukrainian troops, the instant there is a drone overhead and it is not Ukrainian, you better be running or taking cover very quickly into something that you trust, because there will be an artillery strike shortly thereafter, or something even more difficult to defend, which is a drone that will explode in your face. The use of drones is extraordinary. They are terrifying. I thought, you know, for those of us in Eastern Libya, I thought being on the other side of the airplane, you know, when Gaddafi was flying planes over Ras Lanuf when we were all there, and the rebels were firing North Korean anti-aircraft guns, that was terrifying because, you know, they had nothing compared to this to what was in the sky. Drones are actually their own kind of terrifying because it is that simple sound of the drone, and you know instantly that you and the entire unit's a threat. And so that has changed things very much. And being on the front lines in Ukraine is, again, unique simply because of the amount of firepower. You know, we've all covered a lot of counterterrorism, especially. This is covering the Russian military, and so they bring with it an extraordinary amount that is, again, the sights, the sounds, the feelings of all of that.
Tom, don't you think things really changed for journalists in the Balkans when they started putting bounties on the heads? The Sniper Alley, you'll remember, I mark that as a time where it really became increasingly, it was a turning point for journalists in danger. Talk to us about the post-traumatic stress that you see among journalists over the years and how similar it is to the soldiers and veterans that we covered at the Pentagon.
Right. I think the interesting thing that all the audience should know, if you've never spent not just days or weeks, but years of your life in conflict zones, all of us on the panel can tell you about specific instances where it got very, very close. But what you don't really understand is that you go to cover a war, the war covers you, and the longer you do it, the harder it is to wash out. And especially Afghanistan and Iraq, the forever wars. We covered them forever, and we still are. And so, every time you go on a foot patrol in Kandahar, every time you roll out of a forward operating base in Iraq, your soul gets sandpapered because you know this might be the day. The soldiers did it, 7 months for the Marines, 12 months for the other forces, over and over and over again. Jennifer, you walked the Pentagon. You've seen those deployment bars on the arms of the soldiers. Years there. Reporters spent years there. And that's the real difference of modern combat correspondence against those of previous wars. Just the duration of having your soul sandpapered day after day for years at a time.
Our whole adult lives,
Our
basically.
whole adult lives, right.
Yeah. John, let's talk about resilience. And you've experienced a lot of loss in your career, as you pointed out, with Chris Hondras's death and others. You took that shot the moment that Benazir Bhutto was assassinated in Pakistan. How does that affect you, and how do you cope?
Well, I found that oftentimes the way I feel about an event has something to do with how connected I was to it, or connected to people who were there. In the case of Benazir Bhutto, well, let me show that in a second. What I'll do is set this up with a couple pictures from Pakistan. I was there for 3 years. Benazir Bhutto was assassinated towards the latter part of my time there. When I went there, things were fairly peaceful. When I left, they were not. The amount of terrorism that happened in that country skyrocketed during the time between 2005 and 2008 when I was there. Here I'm with a group of rebels in Balochistan. These are Bugti rebels who look very much like Taliban but are not. These guys were fighting against the Pakistani government, and I was able to go for several weeks. There I am, when I still had color in my hair. I was able to go for several weeks with them on horseback. You can see this camel has a rocket launcher on its back. Behind the camel, you see a black bag. That was my satellite telephone, transmitter, which the camel also carried. This shaman for this group of rebels was actually charting the course of their military maneuvers that day by reading the bones, the veins in the bone scapula, shoulder bone of a goat, which they'd cooked the night before. In this particular case, they unpacked this rocket, and the commander, through a translator who spoke terrific English, explained to me that they could either fire it from closer up, where it would be more accurate, or they could fire it from our position there, where it wouldn't be so accurate, but if they fired it from here, it would be safer because the Pakistani forces, when they shot back, would not be able to reach us. And they said, well, and so where should we fire it from? And I was like, you know something? Please don't ask me that question. You don't have to fire it at all. And he said, well, okay, we'll fire it from here. And so they shot off a couple rockets. And sure enough, the Pakistani forces fired back. They came up short. This area, this is what's called a madrasa. I was a school for Islamic teaching. I was there with my translator and actually a police escort because they feared I would be attacked otherwise. This is a Taliban soldier. I was able to get access into a Pakistani Taliban area because my fixer, my translator, knew a Taliban commander, had a relationship, professional relationship where there was some trust. And so I was able to, they showed me all the gold and money that apparently had been donated to them. We'll never know. In this particular situation, this fellow in the middle, during a demonstration, looks like he's about to bite me. They were chanting "Death to America" in Urdu. At the end of the protest, this is in Islamabad, near what's called the Red Mosque. At the end of the protest, they came up to me and said, well, where are you from? And I said, well, I'm not going to play the Canada card. I said, look, I'm American. And this guy looked at me with that same look, without the teeth, and he said, you must know my brother Mushtaq. He's a taxi driver in Detroit. And so sometimes even sayings like death to America, it doesn't necessarily mean death to Americans. It can be against the policy, and sometimes it's performative. As you can see, they're burning CDs, DVDs, and even the Lion King went into the flames. Now we'll look at Benazir Bhutto. She had returned to Pakistan after 10 years in exile. And she came back to a huge following, almost a religious fervor that we normally don't have in this country. And people who showed up adored her. She'd spent a lot of time in the UK. Many journalists came with her from the UK and were there covering the event when she arrived. She survived an assassination attempt. And several months later, when a state of emergency was lifted, she had another campaign rally, her first major one since she'd come back. I was up there on stage with her. As you can see, I'm right behind the podium on a chair. She's talking about, in Urdu, the need to defeat terrorism. And just after she left, when she was leaving, I went out the exit as quick as I could. I didn't want to get caught behind all these people. And I went out, and then suddenly I heard this cheer go up, and she drove out in her armored vehicle, except she was up through the rooftop of it, waving. And suddenly I heard 3 shots, and there was a blast. And anyone who has come close to a suicide bombing, obviously you never forget it. If this had been a car bomb, I wouldn't be here on stage with you. It was a vest. It killed her and about 15 people around her vehicle. And this is a tough picture, but that's what it looks like after an event like that. Now, the question is, would I have returned to that scene? I got pushed back in a stampede. And knowing what we know now about the so-called double tap, where there's often a secondary explosion, would I return to that same scene now? Probably not. You know, we learn from our experiences, sometimes mistakes. I'll show this last set of pictures here, and this is what I consider America's war at home. The killings in Newtown, Connecticut at Sandy Hook back in 2012, all of us have a memory of that, I'm sure. I was living in New York City at the time. Now I live in Connecticut, about an hour away. My daughters were visiting me from DC at that time in New York City, that weekend that this happened. And my editors, thankfully, did not send me right when it happened. I was able to spend a couple days with my kids. But then I got sent up, but it was in time for the funerals. And anyone who's covered an event like this, it's seared into your memory. This is what it looked like there was so much media, there were so many of us from a distance, and the people standing in line for those funerals absolutely hated us. You could feel it. And none of us wanted to be there, nobody wanted us there, but we had to be there. And covering an event like that, and mass shootings, school shootings, it was one of those cases where resilience has not been there for me. I cannot cover those events. My editors are very understanding. We have them, you know, every week in this country. For me, it's a place I can't go to anymore. I did visit last year on the 10th anniversary, and I took, they have a memorial there now, which is very beautiful. I took my daughter with me, and so she could see a memorial to an event that happened when she was visiting me years ago. And my second daughter, some of you here from DC may know, there was a school shooting at Edmund Burke School this last year. And my 16-year-old daughter was going to that school. So no matter what, this story, it just doesn't let up. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the case around the country.
Before we go to questions, I want to ask our other panelists, do you think you were born resilient, or is this something you obtained through going to the front lines? Was this something that was innate to who you were? Elizabeth?
I'm not sure about myself, but I asked that question of the 3 women I wrote about. And I suppose it's the same thing. They were all three were very smart, very curious, and had a longing that they didn't understand what it was for. I think their resilience was born by the incredible difficulties they faced, the hoops they had to jump through, but it led to an understanding of their role as a witness and the importance of the stories that they wrote. And they were great storytellers, all of them, to the point where they not only influenced other women, but Anthony Shadid, for instance, said that Frances Fitzgerald was his motto, because these women, instead of just sticking to the battlefield, which was much more common in those days than today, they purposely looked to the whole country. And Frances Fitzgerald's book, Fire in the Lake, won more prizes than any other book on Vietnam, Pulitzer, Bancroft, National Book Award, because she's the first one who said, what does this mean for Vietnam and the Vietnamese? And that's what Fire in the Lake was about. Kate Webb, there's a prize for her given to the Asian reporter every year who shows not only great bravery, but great humanity. And that's what comes out from all three, is that their resilience had to be nurtured, and it was going through those obstacles, but also finding that amazing discipline of telling the story as a witness and as the human story as well. And there's no place like a war where you feel everything every single minute of the day. I mean, we all know that. Yeah. You walk out the door and you're in the middle of the story. And so anyway, that's the resilience I saw. And I wrote the book also because they're the mothers. They're the women who open it up for us. And that also breeds resilience, I think, to know that there were others before us.
We certainly stand on their shoulders. Nick, do you consider yourself resilient?
It's a good question. I don't know, but I have come to believe what creates resilience in journalists. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll be very quick in this story. The story I tell about resilience is standing over the grave of a man who was tortured and killed by Russian occupiers in eastern Ukraine about a year ago. And I was standing next to his mother, and the grave was being exhumed. And so his body was being dug up by police officers who needed evidence of the Russian torture now that Ukraine had recaptured this territory. And I asked a very simple question, tell me about your son. And, it sounds trite, it sounds exploitative, perhaps, to ask a woman that question on what is perhaps the worst day of her life, other than the day that she learned her son had died. And what I've come to believe is what I call the catharsis of storytelling, that we have to believe that asking that question is not exploitative. It is instead recapturing what the Russians twice stole, his dignity, his name. Empathy means to travel into someone's pain. Traveling into somebody's pain allows me to tell their story, but it also opens me up to trauma. I believe that by asking the question, by exhibiting empathy to her, I'm able to tell his story and her story, and again, recapture what the Russians stole. His name was Maxim. And so I believe we recapture his dignity, his humanity, and that is what we do, and that alone ultimately is what gives us resilience.
Tom, I'm going to come to you for a question, and you'll probably close us out here. How can future generations of reporters be more resilient?
It's a great question, and now that I'm in the post-journalism, post-ego part of my career, having settled in academia, this comes up a lot. And like Nick, I'll answer the question with a story. I was at a panel much like this on campus, and afterwards a student said, tell me how I become a war correspondent. I'll never be fulfilled as a journalist until I cover a war. And I said, so in other words, to be fulfilled, you want people to be killed, maimed, widows created, orphans made, women raped, etc. That person would not be resilient. They're going for the wrong person. Resiliency comes from knowing our mission, all of us here today, all of our colleagues, Evan, we're there to tell a story, to educate the world, to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, and to put a little bit of justice back in the world. And if you're convinced that that's what you're doing, despite the threats, the risk, the danger, you will find resilience.
I think that's an excellent point to end on. And the difference, you know, we've all seen life and death up close and personal. And what makes us different as human beings is that we can tell stories and that we have the ability to humanize this state of being, which seems to periodically raise its head, war. And before we leave, I just want to remember Evan, and we hope he comes home soon. It's barbaric that Putin is holding him as a hostage and as a pawn in this larger battle, but we won't forget our colleagues who are on the front lines, who have lost their lives in the past, and we certainly won't forget Evan. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. I'm Andrea Mitchell from NBC News, and just so privileged to be here with an extraordinary panel and also to follow Jennifer Griffin, my wonderful colleague from Fox News, who's an extraordinary Pentagon correspondent and has such a tremendous career of achievements. And let me introduce our panel, two of whom will be virtual and are joining us from quite a distance in one case, and we're very happy to have them with us. First, let me introduce Jody Ginsburg. I'm looking at Danny Fenster. Jody Ginsburg is, of course, the president of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Represents journalists all over the world and comes out with an annual report. We're going to hear more about some of the trends that they've been developing. Their report comes out usually in November or December, and so we can talk about some of the trends that we are seeing in terms of risks to journalists. Paul Beckett is the assistant editor of the Wall Street Journal. He has been the assistant editor, but now he is spearheading, of course, the Wall Street Journal's efforts to try to secure Evan Gershkovich's release. And so he has been heroically working with the Journal in trying to keep America and the world aware of what has happened to Evan Gershkovich, who has now been held in captivity on false charges of espionage, as many of you know, since last March. Danny Fenster, who joins us now from Southeast Asia. He is the editor-at-large for Frontier Myanmar, an award-winning investigative news magazine covering business and politics. He was imprisoned in Myanmar's, in a prison from the junta there for nearly 6 months in 2021 for his reporting on military-linked businesses, but was released during negotiations led by former US UN Ambassador Bill Richardson, the late Ambassador Bill Richardson, who many of us have traveled with in the past to conflict zones and who we sadly lost just this year. He received the National Press Club's John Aubuchon Press Freedom Award, which recognizes journalists who bravely push to disclose the truth in trying circumstances, and is still working out of Southeast Asia and Myanmar, despite everything that he's gone through. I think he's joining us from Thailand today. Diane Foley, I have known for several years, most tragically, of course, because she is the founder and president of the James W. Foley Foundation. She is doing all of this work, having created the foundation in honor of her extraordinary son. She created it in September 2014, less than a month after the public beheading of James by ISIS in Syria. In 2015, the efforts to fund the start of Hostage US and the International Alliance for a Culture of Safety, and actively participated in the National Counterterrorism Center Hostage Review, which culminated successfully in the Presidential Policy Directive 30, which created the current US hostage enterprise consisting of an interagency recovery fusion cell, and elevated the efforts to bring home our jailed Americans to the presidential level, and giving it great new energy. Jerry Seib was the executive Washington editor for the Wall Street Journal, previously the Washington bureau chief, and a great colleague of mine for many years of covering the White House. He has covered for the Wall Street Journal all of the beats in Washington, the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House. He was briefly detained in Iran in 1987, returned to the Washington bureau, and then successfully was the news editor of the Journal. So we have an extraordinary panel. I thought that we would start with the Committee to Protect Journalists, because give us the global view, if you would, on where journalists are most at risk. I think it would be surprising to some people the countries that are the most dangerous for journalists, actually.
Yes, so I think that the key thing to know is that the environment for journalists everywhere has deteriorated dramatically in recent years. And that's in part because we're seeing a global decline in democracy. And when democracy is under threat, is that okay? When democracies are under threat, is that for me or for you? Okay. When democracies are under threat, then journalists are too, and often the first people to be targeted. Last year, the Committee to Protect Journalists documented a record number of journalists in jail, 363 journalists in jail worldwide. The number one jailer of journalists last year was Iran. Obviously, a number of journalists were imprisoned after the protests there. We saw, as would be expected, a large number of journalists in jail in China, in Myanmar, actually, in Turkey continues to be a significant jailer of journalists, and Belarus. The trend we're seeing increasingly is the misuse of the legal system to target journalists. It used to be the case that regimes would go after journalists often for their journalism, for their speech. But increasingly we're seeing regimes go after journalists for other crimes. National security, for example, accusations of terrorism, accusations of spying. All of these are good ways of muddying the waters so that people can be accused not of having done bad journalism, but actually doing something else. And increasingly also we're seeing journalists targeted over financial crimes, so money laundering, for example, as we see in the case of Jose Ruben Zamora in Guatemala, or tax evasion. Those are the kinds of charges that are brought against journalists in order to get them out of the public sphere where they are challenging regimes with their reporting. So it's an increasingly febrile time for journalists. It's particularly disturbing a new trend that we've seen now, which is this use of espionage charges and national security charges to go after foreign journalists. The vast majority of journalists, it's worth remembering, are arrested in their own countries. But in places like Russia, we're now seeing a trend towards also the targeting of foreign journalists, as we saw in the case of Evan Gershkovich, and that's something I think we need to be really alive to.
And Paul, bring us up to date on where you stand in terms of trying to get Evan home, because he most recently, as I recall, his appeal of the pretrial detention was denied. And what I've learned from covering the Brittany Griner case, Paul Whelan, and others in Russia, just from a reporter's experience, is that the Russian court system, sadly, requires the entire process to be adjudicated, including sentencing, before they will begin to even consider appeals. And that the statistic that we had was that 99% of trials result in conviction.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting this and giving us a chance to talk about Evan. And thanks to all of you for coming. It is like everybody in this room that we're going to be relying on to help us in this cause. So it's greatly appreciated that you took the time to do this. Evan was taken on March 29th when he failed to meet a couple of his check-ins that we had designated, and it became clear very soon afterwards that the security services had taken him on these false charges. Since then, he's been under a series of 3-month pretrial detentions, all of which have been granted by the court. That's when you see him in the glass box that he was on in the video previously. The latest of those will expire at the end of this month. And then we assume that at some point this will proceed to trial. One of the tricky things is that, I think under Russian law, he can be held for up to a year, pretrial detention before trial, so they could keep extending this. I'm assuming that that has some flexibility. And then where we go from there is extremely opaque. We assume a trial on these false charges will come at some point. The Russians have said that they wouldn't entertain any prisoner swaps until after trial, by which, given the statistics that you cited, we assume will mean after a conviction on these false charges. But The opacity is something that is really bedevils us a bit as well, because we just don't know how the process will play out. And we are also, of course, very reliant on the US government to get him out, either through a prisoner swap route, which has been used before, or something else that ideally would short circuit this and stop it and settle it before we even get to that point.
Diane Foley, who is joining us virtually. Diane, talk to us about what your experience was as a hostage parent, and how the work of the foundation and the new presidential directive that you were so importantly involved in creating through pressure after your son's horrible loss. How does that help, do you think, families now in terms of focusing the attention? How would you rate, if you will, the attention of the administration, of the U.S. government, and its willingness to do whatever is necessary to bring people home safely?
Well, I do feel there's been a sea change. When Jim was taken in 2012, our country was not interested. Our administration really felt that to try to negotiate with the terrorists was not something they were ready to do. And therefore, our 4 Americans, it was not just Jim, but there were 4 of them, 2 aid workers, Stephen Sotloff and Jim, the 2 journalists, who were really abandoned by our government. The French, the Spanish, the Italians negotiated for their loved ones to come home, and they practiced journalism to date, or their humanitarian work, but ours were abandoned. So I was angry. I just couldn't believe it. It just felt so morally wrong that France cared about their journalists and were making sure they came home. So wasn't Spain and Italy and others, and ours didn't. And I just could not believe it. And so it was born out of a real frustration, shock. After Jim died, good people stepped up everywhere within the administration, journalists, neighbors. There was a swell of support. A lot of people felt it was outrageous that our government turned its back on its people who were there for humanitarian work or journalism. Same happened with the UK, by the way. So but it seemed evident that something had to change. We had to do better. We could, as citizens, I felt our country could and should do much better. So I'm happy to report that 50 innocent U.S. nationals have come home in the Biden administration alone. And before that, the Trump administration also did very well, bringing many people home. So at least our government now sees it as a priority. President Biden has articulated that several times with the Americans who are held hostage by Hamas. So I do feel our country's trying to do everything they can possibly do. But it is difficult. There's nothing easy about negotiating with people who would take people as pawns. I mean, it's a very difficult process, for sure.
Danny Fenster, thank you so much for joining us from Thailand. I believe you were in Boston and flew to Thailand on your assignments and your commitments there, but we're so grateful to you for joining us from there. Tell us about, but I was wondering, initially, I think everyone would love to know, how did you go from your previous work in Detroit and southern Louisiana to your commitment to Myanmar, and why are you back in South Asia, Southeast Asia, after the experience that you had of being in captivity? What is, if you will, what is the resilience, to use an Adrian Arsh term, that brought you back to, the story that you clearly love pursuing?
Yeah, that's a really long, complicated answer, I think, involving an obsession with George Orwell, who spent some time in Myanmar, in Burma, and a fascination with sort of other cultures and other places. But also, when I was young, when I was in my 20s and starting in journalism, I used to work with a family. I worked with a refugee resettlement agency, and one of the families that we worked with was a Burmese family, and there were a couple kids in the family that were about my age, and I'd kept in touch with. So after a year of working at a small paper in Louisiana, I kind of decided I was getting to a certain age where if I didn't try reporting from abroad, the time might pass. So I just bought a ticket and flew. Myanmar had been on my mind. I was interested in global engagement generally, but Myanmar was specifically on my mind because of that confluence of reasons. And as far as resilience, I think on the last panel, Nick said something about, why we're doing it. The resilience comes from sort of knowing why you're going into it and pursuing it, and sort of restoring dignity and whatnot, which I think is all absolutely true. I think there's another thing when you talk about sort of the decline in democracy and this sort of thing becoming more prevalent. There's a lot of ways, I think, to sort of keep societies open. And I think one of the most important ones, it has to do with that family that we resettled in the United States that I got to know. And it has to do with cultural exchanges and academic exchanges. But it really, really also has to do with keeping lines of communication open between different publics across borders, despite what their political leaders are doing. And I'm at a magazine called Frontier Myanmar that's all Burmese journalists that want to tell their story to the English-speaking world. And our editorial staff, I think, helps them do that. And I just think that's a really strong, important part of sort of keeping the world from slipping back, from rolling backwards in time.
And Jerry Seib, I think we've known each other a long time in different beats in Washington. In your experience, we're seeing something different now because this is hostage-taking, aside from Hamas, which considers itself, it's a terrorist organization that considers itself a governing organization. So I guess it has a hybrid relationship. But what we're seeing now is hostage-taking of journalists as a matter of government policy, certainly by Russia, by Iran. Some would say in Turkey. I don't know if you would agree with that. But especially in Russia and Iran, it's a matter of wanting to develop some leverage for a trade to get one of their prisoners out. Have you seen this evolution?
Yeah, I think that's thank you, Andrea. It's a really important point. And I also want to thank the Atlantic Council and my friend Fred Kemp for doing this. It's important to keep the conversation public and alive. I think that you make a really important point that, in my own little episode in Iran, it attracted a lot of attention because it was unusual at the time. There were journalists and others being arrested, Terry Anderson, for example, not arrested, but taken hostage in Lebanon. I got arrested the same day that Terry Waite was taken hostage in Lebanon. But the difference was I wasn't a hostage, I was a prisoner. I was arrested by a government and charged. That was unusual then. It's now become the norm. We're seeing it all over the place. And why do they do this? Well, as you suggest, journalists or others taken prisoner represent chips in a bargaining in a game. They're valuable. They can be traded. They use journalists in particular as a way to silence or at least chill the local media. If we could arrest that person who comes from a powerful American news organization, we could certainly do worse with you, so you better remember that. And I think they also use it as a way of generally despots want to demonstrate that they're despotic, right? And so they're powerful, and it's a way to do all those things at once with basically an innocent person. And if you take a journalist, you'll get attention for taking a journalist. So, we've seen governments adopt terrorist tactics, more or less, in a lot of ways. This is one of them, and I think it's very insidious because to some extent it works. you know, that they have gotten value out of journalists taken prisoner. I would rather be a prisoner than a hostage, but at some point there's a distinction without much of a difference.
And Jody Ginsburg, when you talk about the journalists who have been imprisoned, what means does the committee have? What can all of we do to increase communication? I mean, one of the egregious things among the many of the 240 hostages that Israel says are now in Gaza is that there has been no compliance with the rules of war, which require the Red Cross to have access to all hostages for communication, notification to families, for medical treatment. I mean, that is supposed to happen, and none of that has happened. So one of the most compelling things about the hostage families that we were interviewing today on Capitol Hill, who came to press senators and House members for more action, was that they don't know whether their loved ones are alive or dead. They've had no messages of any kind. And so they don't know whether they were killed in the original massacre or whether they were brought to Gaza. In some cases, there was video, and supposedly the IDF has identifications and is keeping this count. But the US government says that they actually do not know affirmatively what has happened to the 10 or so Americans, or now, well, two came out, or the 8 that are supposedly left. Jody, how does the committee track the situation for journalists who are held in prison?
Well, look, different regimes respond differently. Some will respond well to international pressure. Shame will help. Sometimes you will find that a journalist is in prison and it's perhaps abuse of power by a local official, and you can put pressure. Just simply the act of having an international focus on that individual can help. And we do know that in many cases that sort of international focus can help. Other countries do not respond as well to that sort of naming and shaming. So China, Russia are good examples where we can continue to shout loudly and talk about abuse of the rule of law, but that kind of thing doesn't necessarily get you to a positive outcome. However, what it does do, and what we know is really beneficial, is it often gets to the individual who is in prison. And simply knowing that somebody is out there fighting your corner is absolutely essential. The number of journalists that we've spoken to who've said that what kept them going was the knowledge that somebody somewhere was still talking about them and fighting for them is huge. It makes all the difference. So simply that act of keeping someone in the news, discussed, sending letters, and there's a huge letter writing campaign in Evan's case, really can make a difference. And then at the Committee to Protect Journalists, where we can, we do prison visits. We often send packages we often give grants, because in some of these prisons, people can't buy basic things like soap and food, and so sending those kinds of packages can be helpful. But keeping that person's story alive is really essential.
Paul, that is something that the Wall Street Journal has done so effectively. You have a megaphone, and other journalists have joined in, and we're wearing the buttons today to keep Evan's name and presence alive, and as a constant. Do we know how he is doing and whether this is helping him and keeping his spirits up? If you can share anything with us.
We get fairly regular reports from his lawyers in Russia who see him and report back, and the report suggests that he is in pretty decent shape, but pretty decent shape under the circumstances, and the circumstances are that he's in a maximum security services prison in the middle of Moscow. And I think the letters do make a huge difference. I think both for him and for his family, I think they're trying to stay in a self-reinforcing kind of loop between Evan and his parents and sister and brother-in-law in Philadelphia and everybody else who contributes to that. I think it means a massive amount. But he works very, very hard at it, just to stay in pretty decent shape under the circumstances. I think he's meditating a lot, he's reading a lot, he's writing, he's playing chess, He's in his cell for 23 hours a day. He has 1 hour of exercise in a confined space. So, you know, yes, he's doing all right, but he works hard to stay all right. I think the knowledge that people are thinking about him and even updating him on world events. I had the privilege of being with his sister for some interviews recently, and you know, she said, well, what he really likes is a bit of celebrity gossip. You don't get celebrity gossip where, you know, obviously the letters of support and sympathy are meaningful and appreciated, but knowing what he has missed, he's a huge Arsenal Football Club fan, so just knowing what's happening with Arsenal, anything that can tell him what's going on in the outside world, because I think he's been so deprived of that, and so much has happened in the 230-something days that he's been there, that that's an important connection for him.
Diane, you mentioned your anger initially, understandably, and seeing that French and other nationalities, other countries were getting their hostages rescued from, or released, I should say, from ISIS. Does this go back to the American policy of, quote, we don't pay ransom for hostages? I mean, I covered the Reagan administration, the Reagan White House, and of course that was the article of faith that led to the Iran-Contra negotiations and the whole scandal. Jerry, I think you were there then as well. But is that a bad policy? I mean, the policy has always been that presidents of the United States have said, if we pay to get people out, as we believe some of our allies, Western allies, did pay to get their people away from out of Syria, that that will encourage more hostage taking. What is your view now?
Well, during the Obama administration, it was more than ransom. It was, we will not even talk to the captors. So by not talking to the captors, there was like no chance, because they had no idea what the captors wanted. You know, as Jody said, some captors want money, sure. Some want concessions of various sorts. There's all kinds of shrewd ways to assess what a captor wants. And then to the negotiating piece is difficult. It is not easy at all. Yes, ransom was part of it. And we continue to struggle with that. We've had several hostages in the last couple of years. One in particular I can think of that we had a similar problem. The family was wanted to negotiate, and our government refused to and would not talk about money with them. And therefore, this person was held 6 long years when the captors came right out and were willing to negotiate within a year. But our country still struggles with that. Understandably, it is complex. We certainly don't want to incentivize in any way. And that's why the Foley Foundation is very strong about the need for us to have a comprehensive deterrence and accountability plan that goes along with our prioritization of our people. So we need both, which isn't easy. It's very complicated, but it still is an obstacle. And it definitely is an obstacle because, of course, captors will ask for the world. They want everything, you know. And so the challenge is to that shrewd negotiation. But if you don't even talk to a captor, that's where Jim, Stephen, Kayla, and Peter's seat was there. They had no chance when that was the case. We must engage with people. We must find ways to talk to people we disagree with and who are doing heinous crimes. And that gets back to what, Danny was saying. We must be able to talk to one another.
I see, Danny, you're nodding in your assent to what Diane is saying, because clearly Bill Richardson had a different view. He was much more proactive all along in getting people out of, whether it was North Korea, so sadly Otto Warmbier was already deathly ill by the time they finally released him. But in your case, maybe you can give us some insights into how that was negotiated, or how did you, what did you even know as you were a prisoner as to what was going on?
Well, I mean, I was nodding along because, I mean, I think that's just such an important point that just should not be controversial in any way, that we should talk. That whether or not you're gonna pay or you're gonna make a trade, or and whether or not that's gonna incentivize and what the trade-offs are for that, those are genuinely very difficult questions to answer. But whether or not to talk and engage, I mean, activists play a really important role in all of this, but they get really hung up on this word about legitimacy, and they worry that if you talk to somebody, you're conferring legitimacy on them. Legitimacy is, I think, kind of what people make of it. I don't think it's possible to legitimate something like the Myanmar junta or something like, Putin. So I think engagement is just necessary. It shouldn't be, that's not a hard question. And that's really the root of the Richardson Foundation's mission, and like that's their #1 starting point, is engage. And I think that is not a criticism of the State Department or any government related thing that has its own set of constraints. Richardson had some leeway because he wasn't technically part of the government, but I just couldn't agree more with what Diane was saying.
Jerry,
I don't know, was there another part of the question that I had missed?
No, I was just.
Oh, what did you,
I was just wondering
you asked
about
what I knew.
what did you know during that period when you were in prison? How much information were you getting from the outside world?
Yeah, funny you asked. Let me grab one thing here. This is the Myanmar state newspaper with Bill Richardson meeting with the junta leader. And that paper was delivered to my sort of ward a couple days after it had happened. And everybody in the cell was kind of telling me, this is a good thing, you're going to get out. I really had no idea what to believe at that point, so I was just kind of trying to ignore it. But you hear whispers of things the entire time, and some things turn out to be true, some things turn out to be false leads, so you just stop believing in anything. And like I know Evan is doing, you just concentrate on that 1 hour of exercise. You get the book that you're reading, your breath when you're meditating, and that's all you're really thinking about.
Jerry, what have we lost by the decisions by other news organizations not to send correspondents back to Moscow and to withdraw their teams from Moscow? And in fact, some people are leaving China. Others are not sending people to Iran. So what have we lost by all of these brilliant independent journalists, Russians, who have now become expats and are working from other countries?
To go back to the earlier part of the conversation, why do they do this? Why do the bad guys do this? Well, the other reason is it scares off coverage. It takes the spotlight away. I mean, it's an intimidation factor. It's an intimidation tactic, and it works. There are fewer journalists in Russia today than there would be had Evan not been arrested. There are fewer journalists in China today than there were before the Chinese government began putting pressure on them. There is a understandable reluctance to go to Iran. That is beneficial if you're running the Iranian regime and you want to keep a lid on things and you don't want troublemakers in. The good news, though, Andrea, I think, is that people who go into foreign correspondence is kind of a self-selected group. There are people who are idealistic, who think that part of the mission of journalism is, in fact, to shine a light in dark corners of the world. And they will go to great lengths to do that. They will take risks to do that. One of the jobs of a news executive is to help reporters limit the risks they take, because they will go as far as they can because they believe in the mission. And I don't want to sound hokey about that, but I think people will continue to try. But part of the goal of the problem that we're discussing today is to make it harder to do that. It's to make it harder to describe to people what's happening in Iran. It's to make it harder to describe to people what is happening in Putin's Russia. And unfortunately, it's effective, and you have to admire all the more the people who are persevering in spite of that. That's what's lost, I think. And the bad guys know that. That's part of the plan.
We've had the experience, of course, of Jason Rezaian from Iran. I don't know, Jody, if you had conversations with him. I had over these years, and was working with his family and others from the Washington Post. But he is so valiant and strong in coming out of that hostage experience, imprisoned experience.
Yes, his wife is actually our senior researcher for the MENA region, and they do together amazing work, Jason and Yagane, keeping this issue alive. And actually, Jason was one of the first people that came out of the gate when Evan was arrested to say this is a hostage taking. We should not view this as, we shouldn't go with the Russian narrative that he's a spy. We should be very clear that this is a hostage taking by the Russian government. And I think it's worth remembering now that there are now 2 Americans being held by the Russians. There was an arrest last month of an RFEL reporter as well, who is a dual citizen. And one of the things that's very interesting about what the Russians are doing increasingly is they're both imprisoning and actually denying visas to people who are really fluent Russian speakers or who have some kind of dual citizenship. And that tells you something, I think. It tells you something about what a danger they see that those people represent. These are not correspondents coming in who need translators, who need drivers. These are people who can talk directly to the people and find out what's happening. And I think it tells you a lot that those are the people that the Russian government is going after because they see them as a threat, in the same way that Jason, who was also a dual citizen, was viewed as a threat. And I think it's worth remembering that. And it's also, to Diane's point, why it's so essential that governments take responsibility for their citizens. The UK, my home country, has not had a great record of that. We have a British citizen currently in a Hong Kong jail, Jimmy Lai, who was one of the leading media proprietors of the country. There's a reason that he is in jail, and it's because he ran the biggest pro-democracy, independent newspaper in the territory. This is a pattern that authoritarian and sadly increasingly sliding democracies use to prevent people reporting on what's happening in those countries. And it's really important that countries like America, which makes a great deal out of the First Amendment and its support of the free press, is absolutely vocal in defending it in country, but also internationally, and also does everything it can for its own citizens.
I should mention, we have a few questions from our people online, and one of them is about the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty colleague, Alsu Kumasheva, whom you just referenced, who was detained in Russia last month. She's now the 2nd American journalist behind bars in Russia. There are also other Americans, we should point out, Mark Fogel, and Paul Whelan.
Can I just mention, in her case, the Radio Free Europe reporter wasn't even engaged in journalism. She wasn't even resident in Russia. She was living in Prague. She was visiting Russia to see her ailing mother. So the idea that as a journalist she had done something illegal, that fiction can't even be maintained in her case. She wasn't even engaged in journalism. She was on a visit to her sick mother and was arrested anyway.
But it's, again, this abuse of law that's happening. So she's been charged of not registering as a foreign agent. These are all the kinds of tactics. You fail to fill in the correct form. You don't license yourself properly. There are all these sort of very Byzantine, bureaucratic almost tactics to target journalists, but without actually saying it's for their journalism or for being affiliated to a journalist organization.
Well, and actually in the case of Evan, he's been falsely accused of espionage. He was registered. He had notified people where he was going out in that district. And he is, of course, ethnically Russian from his parents who had emigrated in the 70s and is a fluent Russian speaker. I remember in the 90s, I was in Vietnam before normalization, doing interviews with American business people in anticipation of Warren Christopher coming and normalizing relations. And I was relying on a Vietnamese minder or, translator. And every night I would go back to our people in Vietnam, to our base there in the hotel and retranslate everything because the translations from the minders were so inaccurate. So that is exactly, Jerry, what you're referring to, that these are generally journalists who do have language proficiency. Let me take another question from one of the people online. This is a question about resiliency. How should students who are taking their first steps into the field of journalism build resiliency, which is something that we know that Adrienne Arsht and the Atlantic Council are working on, and elevating the importance of institutional governmental resiliency, but also individual resiliency, as Adrienne mentioned in her introduction. So let me go around. Danny Fenster, in Myanmar and in your other work elsewhere in the region, how did you, as a young journalist, build resiliency as part of your adventurous spirit?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can only look back in retrospect and kind of try to make sense or come up with an answer after the fact, because it wasn't like I was going in and preparing mentally for this. Yeah, I had never thought of myself as particularly resilient. But I think when you go to Myanmar to practice journalism, you do know that this is possible, no matter how unlikely you think it is. Early on there, the first journalist I met, a man from Rakhine State in the West, he was covering a conflict that was happening there from Yangon, and his editor had just been charged with a crime that could have seen him in prison for a very long time for just publishing something about the conflict. Nothing happened for a little while, and then later on, that journalist that I knew did a story about a small business owner who found herself in court being sued, and he just was reporting on the court case, the court records. Not exactly a political thing. She charged him with something. They have very, very arcane libel laws, and then he was facing prison out of something that was not the most sensitive thing he had been reporting on. So you know that when you're working in that environment that it's possible, even though you don't think it'll ever happen. And then it happens. And I think maybe my partner Juliana kind of came up with this, and I think she's right, but I hadn't thought of it. Once you're there in prison, you do have that journalist mentality where you're like, well, this is definitely a scoop. There's no other There's no other Western journalist that has seen this place, and that's fascinating. And that sustains you for a little while. And the longer it takes, the more worried you are that it's not going to end. But I think I don't know, maybe there's a personal disposition. I'm not sure. I don't know.
I think there is something about journalists, especially in conflict zones, as Jennifer and her colleagues were expressing, that certainly have that desire to follow the story wherever it goes, even when it's sadly yourself. Diane, your son had that resiliency, and so did you, in so quickly deciding with your determination to do something about it.
We just felt compelled, Andrea. We could do better as a country. I was disgusted with the way it was handled. And in our journalism safety curricula, where the Foley Foundation really cares a lot about building this resiliency and aspiring journalists. And I think part of it is being aware of the risks that, and really going into journalism for the right reasons, that you really do want to bear witness. You truly want to hear what another person is going through. What is it you want to convey to the world? Why is your story from Thailand, Myanmar, Iran, Russia vital, so that we can understand one another? So I think all of that is important. And so within our journalism safety curricula, we talk about that. We talk about doing risk assessments, why you have to be aware, you have to think this through. Don't be in a naive bubble about the world. I just think it's important that aspiring journalists understand the risks and why it's still vitally important to that journalism is essential in the world.
I think we're just about out of time. I just want to, first of all, thank all of you. Diane Foley, you're one of my heroes. Danny Fenster, for your extraordinary work and your courage in going right back. And to my colleagues here, Jody Ginsburg, and all the great work of the committee to protect journalists. Paul Beckett, just let us all know what more we can do, what stories we can write. We know that the US government says that it doesn't have someone of the caliber in an American prison that would meet Russia's demands, because Russia says it has to be a spy for a spy. And of course, Evan is not a spy, but to get him out, I think you would trade almost anybody, but they say that they don't, and it's been widely reported that there is an assassin in a German prison, a Russian assassin, for an assassination that took place in broad daylight in Berlin that Germany simply will not give up. And this is someone that they were demanding for Brittany Griner as well, until they settled for their arms dealer. But Paul Whelan is still there, and Evan Gershkovich. We should mention Austin Tice, who is still missing in Syria and is believed in prison, is believed alive there. I've talked to his parents, the Washington Post. And Jerry Seib, thanks so much to you for everything that you've done over many decades in journalism. And above all, my thanks to Fred Kemp and the Atlantic Council and Adrian Arsht, who has single-handedly elevated this issue to such prominence. The fact that Adrian and Fred are putting a spotlight on all of this, that the Atlantic Council giving us this opportunity, is such an important way to make people widely aware of the real challenges to journalism in an authoritarian, increasingly authoritarian world, where governments now are making imprisonment of journalists actually a policy of their national security in a really evil, incredibly evil way. So thank you all for being with us today.
So just a couple of words as we close. I'm Fred Kemp. Thank you for your kind words. President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. I must tell you something. There's a lot of different aspects to resiliency, but I think Danny just taught us one of them, which is humor, which is, you're in prison, you don't know when you're going to get out, and you say, well, at least this is a scoop. And I think humor is a piece of it. But thanks to all of you who are here at our headquarters. Thanks to those tuning in around the world. Jennifer, Andrea, this was, thank you for leading such powerful conversations this afternoon. And Adrian and Almar, one of the things that's great about this, Jerry, Paul, Almar, is these are almost lifelong friends. And we've been stomping out the grapes in the vineyards of truth for a long time, so it's great to see you here. As Almar knows, Evan's plight and these conversations have a deep meaning to me. I spent 30 years as a reporter and editor in the Wall Street Journal and at Newsweek, most of that period spent abroad, and much of it as a roving correspondent for the Wall Street Journal in Europe and the Middle East. When I heard Nick talk about going into the job and saying, asking anyone anything, and that is my job. It's just a remarkable luxury, having covered wars in Panama, Lebanon, Afghanistan, between Iran and Iraq. I've experienced some of what you've seen today and heard today firsthand, having covered the rise of solidarity in Poland, the last days of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. I've also experienced that it isn't just war that presents the corresponding dangers. I was close to Danny Pearl and worked alongside him, and he, of course, paid the worst price in Pakistan for, as Almar said in his opening comments, just doing his job. When the most consequential developments occur in the world, when crises break, when wars are waged, when power is abused and must be checked, brave correspondents are there to see it, to assess it, to speak for what is real, what is true, and we're seeing that now in Israel and Gaza and in Ukraine. The work that Evan did reporting from Russia before his arrest, the work that many of our panelists, moderators have done and do the work of journalists who couldn't be with us today from dangerous places for reporters, China, Mexico, Iran, and more, is a service to us all and one that must be defended. So we hope that today's conversation is part of a sustained effort to build upon resilience in this field, in correspondence, and in all of us as individuals, as citizens of societies committed to freedom and democracy, of which a free press will always be a fundamental pillar. I found it particularly interesting to hear journalists talk about how they draw resilience they draw their resilience from the commitment to what they're doing and from their sense of purpose to what they're doing. What didn't get said that I want to add at the end of this is the resilience of our free society depends on these First Amendment gladiators. And in the end, that's what we're talking about is individual resilience, but then the collective resilience of our societies and our free societies around the world. So now I'd like to invite those who are here in person to become even more resilient outside. We have some food and drinks, and we can continue the discussion. I think a lot of you would like to reflect on what you've heard here. For those of you who have joined us virtually, this is what we learned during the period of Zoom, is that we need to be with each other. This is a really great moment that we can continue to discuss here. But without this global reach, without this community of influence that we have all around that have listened to this today, we wouldn't have nearly the influence on this situation where we need to do whatever we can to help Evan. And there I'll speak to another source of resilience, and I think we heard this from Danny as well, is I think we hope Evan will feel more resilience knowing that we're with him, knowing that there's hope beyond his own internal resilience. And I think knowing that people are with you also is a source of that resilience. So let me quote Almar, re-quote Almar and what he said in his opening statement to close. Keep fighting for freedom of the press, keep fighting for journalists, and keep fighting for Evan. So thank you to you all for attending.